X didn't do it, Y didn't deliver, and so on. So you got to do a couple of projects to learn, and that's something that is fundamental.
So what was your experience in Brazil, for example? I mean, culturally, what were some of the challenges you had?
Oh, we've had a lot of challenges, not only in Brazil and
China.
Let me start with Hungary. The first global center we started was in Hungary, and we sent a manager from here, and all the people who were hired were locals. And the very first week, this guy went and called for a meeting on a Friday. He announced the meeting at 4:30 Friday evening. He sent out a mail for a 6 p.m. on Friday evening. No wonder no one turned up. So it took quite a bit of time to educate our people here, as well as educate them about not only cultures, about habits, work ethics, and so on and so forth. Similarly, Brazil has a different culture. But what I find it very interesting is, as long as you plan this and you are very clear about the values that you want to inculcate and integrate into the firm, and you go about it with the conscious behaviors and work habits of the different cultures, it is possible to create a great one firm culture. And it's not easy, and you've got to plan it, and you've got to do it over and over again, but we are able to achieve that.
Okay. Pradeep, Chandra touched on the values. I mean, Accenture is a global organization, global value system. So, I mean, how would you describe your, drive? What are the values in Accenture which helps the cultural fit, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the title of this this panel here is global sourcing, multi-sourcing, and one of the trends you see is companies are looking for vendors that can provide them, that can serve them in a global manner. So we've got relationships like Wyatt, where we are serving them across not just application outsourcing, but BPO, 22 languages, 30 countries, right? 10 languages, 28 countries. You've got a deal like Unilever, where we're serving 200,000 of their employees, 22 languages, 100 countries. So you've got to have a global footprint that allows us to serve our clients wherever they are. Now, if you look at our global delivery network, it is truly a global delivery network. Now, India is a very important part of that. So 50% of our global delivery network is in India. Out of the 53,000 people, roughly half of that is in India, but it is not an India-centric model. It is a global model, and we serve our clients from wherever they are, and that mitigates a lot of the cultural resonance that you have to deal with. Now, of course, when you come to India, you go through many of the points that Chandra talked about, which is sensitization from a cross-cultural awareness perspective, but that's a secondary sort of strategy.
Byron, it's an interesting thought process going on here, but as a customer, do you see a difference between, say, an Indian company which is getting global, and then there's a company, say, Accenture, which is the US based originally, and now it's a global company? Are they?
I think there are cultural differences between the providers, just as you'd find in any companies anywhere in the world, that there's a different focus on the way they think about investing in their employees, how much emphasis they put on kind of putting career paths in place. So I think that is the case. But one of the things I think is important as you think about the people mix and the cultural mix is what's the function that you're thinking about. There are some functions that actually, because it's a back office function and there's not a lot of people interaction, the cultural elements aren't as important as other functions. And you really need to differentiate that in your head as you think about the value chain for the business. So for instance, and some of this ties back to kind of SLAs and contracts, I guess. We did a big outsourcing of some call centers, which is a very, very kind of intimate thing for us because you're handling our customers and you're dealing with them. And we spent a lot of time trying to make sure we had a provider that lined up with how we thought about handling customers, how we thought about driving value for our customers. And even after that, we had challenges, and the challenges actually were not reflected in the SLAs. So the scorecard showed everything was green. But when we started talking, getting feedback from customers, they were very unhappy about this outsourcing. And so we started surveying them. We found that 92% of the users of this call center said they couldn't understand the person on the phone. They're pretty fundamental. Well, it hadn't actually occurred to us to put an SLA around voice and accent in place, so we didn't know that was important. So we subsequently aligned that that's an important thing, we need to measure it. We put a scorecard around it, and they pretty effectively, over the course of a few months, went from 92% had problems understanding it down to about 15%. I mean, it was a dramatic change because they started training their people differently. They started getting very focused on it as an important metric. These have to be, one is you have to find a provider who has that willingness to work with you on it. You cannot look at these contracts like they're etched in granite because they'll never work. There's too many variables and too many changes. And there's also a lot of learnings along the way that you just don't know when you start down this path. Even after you've done a dozen of these things, you get surprised by new functions. And there's the other thing I think you need to understand as you look at some of this is there are different levels of maturity in the marketplace from a capability perspective. So, outsourcing a network support or a data center is very different than outsourcing your analytic research function or your product development function, which once again are much more hands-on kind of functions that have to blend into the rest of the organization.
As you involved in many multi-country kind of deals. I mean,
well, Brian and I were talking beforehand, and if I can pick up a point and then I'll lead to the cultural, there's a lot of organisations still to this day pick an outsourced provider based on the financials. And they'll say the cost, and Brian made a very, very good point, is that you want to work with a service provider that will grow with you or get the outcomes that you want to achieve. And I always ask whenever we're involved in helping in that vendor selection process, is yes, cost is an important factor, but when you look across the table at that particular vendor, what's really important is saying, can I work with this vendor going forward? And you've heard from great firms like Accenture and TCS, but it's really important from that side is that can you have a good cultural fit, regardless from a global point of view or local point of view, the cultural fit with that organisation is absolutely crucial. Because you may have when you do have a long-term, and I do really see it as a marriage, you want to be there for a long time, because to then rip it apart, and I've been involved in a number where we've had to rip these marriages apart, the divorce is very messy for both sides. And I ask the vendors whenever we're involved or with the client, make sure you really like each other. I know I'm being seen a bit trite and simple, but you've got to like each other first, and you want to grow with each other.
So could I
Yeah.
add to that?
Please,
so
go
before we came in here, we agreed to
Disagree.
disagree. We agreed that somewhere along the way we will disagree. So here's my opportunity to.
well, I told them it's a session after lunch, so I want at least one fight.
So I think liking each other is fine, but if you're sitting across from a vendor and what you're getting back is this sort of a notion of what would you like us to do, then what you're getting is somebody who's being submissive and order taker. I've had cases where there was a recent meeting with the CIO of a very large company that has thousands of people here, and they've had thousands of people here sending work packages. After about 4 to 5 years of that, you say, well, I'm not getting the results. No. And they called the meeting of all the vendors and wanted to talk about how do we move to outcome. And 3 out of the 4 vendors said, well, that sounds great. What would you like us to do? Well, that's not outcome. That thinking is sort of ingrained in, give me a transaction and I'll take care of the transaction. You want a vendor that's willing to and able to push your thinking and cause you to sweat a bit, which may not be something you like, but it's going to be good for you for the long term.
But that doesn't mean all marriages you like. It's as long as both partners are assertive.
But Sandeep, I think there's an important point there, is that there is tremendous thought leadership in a lot of these firms.
Yeah.
That these firms will have more experience outsourced than I ever will.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that rarely happens is that people bring me that experience to the table.
Yeah.
So I'm usually trying to pull it out, but one of the, I think the real untapped potentials in these relationships is really pulling some of the providers to the forefront, providing thought leadership. People tend to focus on the financials, and they get the financial results they want, and they're kind of manage these things relatively benignly. Yep. And I think they're just, they're missing a huge opportunity to help think about their business models differently, take advantage of a much broader set of skills and experiences across a lot of businesses.